Creative people are the trusted communicators of our society, a society that is ridden with more fear, loneliness, and anxiety than ever.
We recognize that creative people and those championing their work should be honored for who they are and treated with care as they devote their lives to articulating the human experience.
My name is Samantha Jervey.
My name is Emily Falvey.
Together, we're the co-founders and co-host of Mind Over Melody, a podcast focused on wellness for artists, songwriters, and music industry professionals.
We pray our conversations can be a safe place for you to rest, grow, contemplate, and be reminded that your wellness matters first and foremost, and ultimately leads to the kind of creativity that sustains and abounds.
Thank you for listening to Season 1 of Mind Over Melody. We'd like to give a special thank you to our sponsors for this season, Truist and Porter's Call, and to our editor, Cooper Carr. The content of this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or a qualified mental health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or mental health issue. If you are experiencing a crisis or need immediate help, please contact a local mental health service or emergency services. Other resources are available on our website at mindovermelody.com.
Hello, friends. Welcome to Mind Over Melody. My name is Emily Falvey, and to my right is Samantha Jervey, who's extraordinary. And we are here. We'll be really transparent and candid. We're supposed to have an interview with somebody today that is not technically working out currently. So we're just here and wanting to have a conversation with each other about what's going on in our lives and just kind of the vulnerability that's required to do this life. And so we were sitting here waiting for our guest, and I thought we should just continue this conversation because I think that our listeners would probably benefit from it. So, Sam, tell me how you're feeling this morning and what's on your heart.
I am feeling okay. Yeah.
I relate to that deeply.
Just easing into the morning. I don't know about you, but there's a handful of rituals that I come back to. And the irony is that our last question, our signature question on this podcast is kind of, what does wellness look like for you? And I was thinking about that this morning as I was sitting coffee to my left. Which one of my favorite rituals is that my husband makes coffee every morning and it's there when I wake up.
What a gift.
Yeah, truly. But I used to have such a consistent journaling practice. And it's interesting because I find that sometimes I journal mostly through negative seasons more than I do positive seasons. And so to balance that, I wouldn't define this season as either or. It was just, hey, I want to check in. I've got a few minutes before I have to start getting ready for, our commitment this morning. And it was nice. It was a good way to ground and kind of let the caffeine soak into my body, but also just kind of check in with where I was at, which is an understated practice when we're moving a million miles per hour.
Yes. I do think there's something to that consistently showing up for yourself and starting your day with intention. I notice my morning ritual also revolves around my morning coffee, but I read the Bible with my dad every morning. And that's been a really sweet thing we've done. We've been reading the New Testament in a year together. And so every morning I wake up with my morning coffee and do that. And I notice the mornings that I'm too busy and rush out the door to a meeting or I oversleep or whatever, how chaotic my day starts versus when I take the time to sit down, breathe. We use this app called Through the Word. I sometimes read holy text and I'm like, what did I just read? What just happened? There's all these crazy names and things that are going on that I don't understand. But there's this app called Through the Word that does like a 10-minute explanation, and it helps me to understand so much more. And I take notes, and just, it's a similar journaling practice for me of just getting to, you know, spend time with God, my higher power, and with my dad. And that's been really just a joy to start my day well. So I love that you take part in that as well.
That's so beautiful. It's such an anchor And I love the community piece too. Like, to share that with your dad is so special. Kind of a pivot, but on topic of what we were talking about before we pressed record this morning. Like, I know that this week, past few weeks in particular for you, have been tremendously busy. You've been traveling a lot. You've had doubles with people you really look up to. And, you know, so, and then you leave tomorrow morning for a work trip, hop on a plane at 6 a.m. So I'd love to just hear kind of where you're at and how, as a creative, you are managing or not everything that's on your plate right now.
Yeah. I mean, I love that question. I think the more work I do, the more I realize how I used to be able to power through a lot better than I do, because I think I've gotten a lot more in touch with how I feel and what my body needs. And when I think I've always been a high achiever, Enneagram 3 type of person that overcommits and undersleeps and have not put self-care at the forefront of my life. And I look at when I'm overcommitted, I feel like it just primes for burnout. And that's something that I wish we talked about more. I think in our industry specifically, that burnout is kind of glorified, or just the grind and the hustle culture. I feel like we've already touched on this in some episodes, but some of me is so tempted. I mean, I'm a big comparer, which is something I want to work on, but I look to my left and to my right, and I want to make sure I'm working as hard as everybody else is, because we're in a competitive industry. So I try to keep everybody's work ethic. I want to always be living up to that or exceeding that, and be a valuable employee to the company that I'm contracted with. But at the same time, I think also trying to do this job with an element of self-care is a little bit counterintuitive at times. And so I feel the tension in that. You know, I think I've been rewarded a lot more for the nights that I stayed out until 2 a.m. and was hanging with an artist at the bar or whatever. I think that gets a lot more props from the industry. Yeah. I just think that our industry really glorifies hustle culture and the grind. And I, as somebody who looks around and compares myself to other people, I am constantly trying to keep up with the Joneses, or, you know, keep up or exceed expectations of what everybody else is doing. And so I think in this season of my life, while trying to prioritize myself, my capacity has been less because of everything that's on my plate outside of work. And I think I shame myself. I can spiral pretty easily into like, well, you're not doing enough and your songs aren't as good as blah, blah, blah. And it's such a hard industry to just stay in your own lane and not look to your left and to your right. And so I'm trying to be as gentle with myself as I can. I definitely need to work on my own self-talk. I think that's one of the things that I can control, is being kinder to myself. My default setting is that my inner critic is very loud at all hours of the day. And so I don't know what it is. That's the work I need to do, is just learn how to honor her and take her opinions under advisement, but not let them like be what drives my bus all the time. I'm just trying to be gentle. And in this, so I had those 2 doubles on Monday and Tuesday, and then I'm headed to a camp where I'm going to be doing doubles until 3 a.m. for the next 4 days. And so I'm staring down what's ahead of me, and it's a high pressure camp and a high pressure situation. And in those moments, I feel a lot of like, but pressing into the joy of connecting with new people and creating something that we're passionate about, and trying to lean into the joy from the process and connecting with human beings. That's the part that I love about my job. And so I try to keep that at the forefront. And some days that's easier than others, but I'm trying to meet myself where I'm at and honor myself. So I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Oh, it does. It does. There's like 2 avenues that my brain was going down. One being my experience in my early 20s in the music industry.
Yes.
And then kind of the secondary path too of sort of this parts language you were talking about, and the inner critic. really from one of my favorite therapeutic modalities. And so I'll start there and then kind of come back to how I deeply resonate with that experience you're describing. But what I loved about what you said a second ago was like, I'm trying to have her not be the one driving the bus, right?
Yeah.
And we've talked about this offline, but I love what's called internal family systems, and IFS, as it's known, created by Dr. Dick Schwartz. And really it is with this whole concept of like, we are a culmination of parts. And from a psychological, like the field of psychology, that standpoint, I think we've pathologized having these competing thoughts. Like so many approaches in the therapy space can be, okay, well, that's a really bad thought. And that's not to discredit. Like, I think cognitive behavioral therapy, best known as CBT, is such a gift. It can be so wonderful and helpful for many, many things, especially depression, anxiety, right? We cannot trust every thought we have.
Amen.
There's a visual that I learned before I went back to grad school for counseling. It was really helpful. I would do like, what was the app? One of those, it was a meditation app. I use Calm
like
now.
Headspace or Calm. Yeah.
Yeah, it was Headspace. And they had this visual of the clouds floating by, right? And that being your thoughts, or even balloons floating by. And how you can choose to engage or not engage. And I think something I've noticed in my own life, but also in having the privilege of sitting with people in a therapeutic setting, is that it's not the thought itself that distresses us. It's the secondary narrative that comes in and forms an opinion and tells us, oh my gosh, you had this thought, and now that means you are blank. Like they're identity defining statements. And so that's always what I want to come back to, and where I think IFS can be so incredibly helpful, because you like externalize all these warring voices or these competing voices. There was a therapist, I don't know him, but someone dear who saw an IFS specialist, and they said their therapist would call it a parts shitstorm. And it is definitely like not clinical language, but also like, I love it because sometimes we are just right. Like when we feel overwhelmed, or dare I say, when we feel numb, I often believe that numbness is not a byproduct of the absence of feelings. In fact, it's the overwhelm of feelings. We are just so cognitively overloaded and bogged down that our body goes into like a self-preservation, which in the language of IFS would be a protector part. Yes. So as you were describing, like this part of you that's the comparison and inner critic. And I don't know if those are two different parts or if they're like the same part. That's only yours to discern and name. But it's really powerful and counterintuitive, honestly. Yeah. Like so much of psychology sometimes focuses, or the human experience focuses on like grin and bear it, pull yourself up from the bootstraps.
Yes.
Ignore the negative self-talk, you know? And it's both and. It's way more nuanced. So it's not like cut and dry that there's one path that's better than another. However, I will say that in my own experience, I don't find that ignoring or trying to push down those thoughts is actually productive in the long run.
Amen.
It's actually when I've, right? Like, because then they just kind of live there and they fester.
Yep.
Which Brene Brown has used that metaphor a lot around shame, which is one of her top, research back topics. It's like shame cannot live when it is brought into the light.
Amen.
And I think that fits beautifully when you think of it in terms of IFS. It's like shame, it thinks it's doing something, right?
Yeah.
This could be true for many parts, but on the topic of shame, because you were talking about it, shame, especially in this industry, it can tell us like, oh, well, no, I'm motivating you, right? Like if you stop, like all of this around you or your concept of what you want to achieve, like it could fall apart.
Yeah.
And it's motivating you in a really like sideways kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think through the lens of IFS, it's like a reparenting process where you yourself are the parent. And there's this concept of capital S, self.
Mm-hmm.
You are trying to tap into that self, all the parts aside, right? Like you have your protectors or your, these are the parts of you that just really, really want to control the narrative and they feel like they're doing a really good job at it.
Mm-hmm.
So shame would be one of them, perfectionism, workaholism.
Yep.
This could look a lot of different ways. Then you have the firefighters.
Yeah.
Those are the things that I think we also see a lot in this industry is, oh my gosh, I don't know how to cope with this, so I'm going to go get drunk at the bar.
Yes.
Or I'm going to smoke weed until it's just not at the forefront anymore and I can kind of like calm.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the parts that come in and they're like, this is too much. And they don't care what gets harmed in the way. They just, why they're called firefighters is there's this mental visual of they come in with the hose and they just spray everything. And it doesn't matter if they wreck your whole house in the process.
Yeah.
However, both your protectors or your managers and your firefighters are fighting to protect what we call your exiles.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the deeper work. That's our invitation with curiosity, compassion to say, okay, typically these are younger parts or they're parts that in our developmental phase, it could have been our early 20s, right? Like emerging adulthood. These are the blueprint parts where at some point we took away the narrative. When I do this, it means I could feel this. Yeah. Like if I show up that way or if I set a boundary, then I will be told I am less than nothing or I'm replaceable or I am unworthy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's delicate work. You do want to partner with someone safe who can walk you through that, which is where I think therapy is such a gift.
Yeah.
But I think in this industry specifically, everyone's story is so different.
Mm-hmm.
But we all, like at the heart, are creatives and we're somehow performers.
Yeah.
And otherwise you wouldn't, I don't know. I don't think we would engage in the industry because it is such a performative, even if you're behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, you see a lot of people who are like, yeah, I worked with this person or I worked on this project and this is what I aspire to be. And all of those things are not inherently bad.
Yeah.
However, if they are solely your identity, then that feels like you're operating out of a part versus, your core self of like both and.
Yeah.
I use that term way too much.
It's a gift, I think.
It's honestly a reminder to myself every time. And I want to be so delicate in when I talk about these things because it's not black and white. It is nuanced I'm not saying it's bad to have career goals, lofty career goals and aspirations. I'm not saying it's bad to aspire to be a part of that number one or that Billboard Power Players list. Like that in and of itself is not bad. It's what is the driving force behind that? And are you able to separate yourself at the end of the day enough to give enough room to say, I'm worthy regardless of those things?
Yeah.
And I think that's true of every facet of the music industry and entertainment. So yeah, I don't know. That definitely kind of grew out of my own experiences.
Yeah. What you and I share is that we both have the same kind of, we grew up in similar family systems, and we've talked about that offline of who our parents were and how we grew up. And I look around and both, at least I don't want to speak for you, but my experience was be the bright, shiny star and perform, and that'll allow you to be accepted. I moved around a lot and was constantly having to be nimble and figure out, okay, how do I fit into this system? And how do I quickly become the cream that rises to the top? Because that was what was expected of me growing up. And I think in such a at times our industry can be so wild and dysfunctional. And I think my own dysfunction is so exacerbated in a system where the bright, shiny stars are so rewarded. And I think that is exactly reinforcing how I grew up of just you can perform your way into being loved. You can achieve your way into being accepted. And I think, I don't know if you relate to that, but that's something that I'm having to unlearn and relearn, that I have inherent worth as a human being, and it has absolutely nothing to do with my output. And I think that's hard when I derive so much joy inherently from what I do and from the creation process. But at the same time, I am not what I create. I am so separate from that. So I don't know if you relate to that with how you grew up.
Yeah. I mean, the statement, perform your way into being loved, and it wasn't conscious. It wasn't like I was thinking that. And also, I don't ever think my parents explicitly said, they certainly didn't. Like, I know in their heart of hearts that they love me regardless. Yep. And because my narrative or story was a little different in that I was in the same small town for, up until 17, 18 years when I then moved to Nashville to go to Belmont. And I had just been the performer, I did musical theater. I was a dancer, and excelled at a rate that garnered attention, but also that became so deeply ingrained in who I was and what I do. And sure, I felt people liked me. I also felt people didn't like me because of those things. And you better believe that when I got to Belmont and Nashville, so much of those layers resurfaced. Very compassionately, sometimes in onslaughts, but sometimes just in slivers, as I kind of grew into my 20s. And a lot of it emerged in working in the music business, especially my first job. And so many patterns were being recreated where I started to excel early in my career. And some people were really in my corner and rooting for me, my parents being some of those people. And then others I literally had someone from college look at me and say, how are you, what are you doing? How are you excelling? With skepticism, right? Questioning, maybe my integrity, my approach. It was a young man who asked me that question, and I was like, what is the implication? Just so many layers to that too. But it was hard, but I'm also grateful for those experiences because it was what, I could have kept living, kind of sleeping my way through life, right? I could have kept on this path where everyone is telling me, oh my gosh, you go, Sam, you're going to be this, you're going to be that. Yep. And I think that's the difference, right? Is okay, there are versions of ourselves that yes, people will affirm and love, and like on the other side, people will also really dislike and feel their own stuff around because it taps into parts of their story. But I don't know. I think 2020 was the first time where really things halted and I was able to pause and sincerely take into consideration, if I continue down this path, what does that mean for the future trajectory? And again, neither here nor there, but something we've also talked a lot about outside of this space this morning is value-based choices.
Absolutely.
And at the core, that's what it was boiling down to for me is what do I value? Not just professionally, but then how do my values support my professional, my personal, spiritual, physical, all these things, right? So I had to get really real about what that looked like and what that meant and how to then like advocate for that.
I think that's beautiful.
It's a really scary thing to do because there's a lot of grief in saying, oh, I've been operating for 24 years as this person who's derived a lot of worth or a lot of her identity from excelling.
Yes.
From being excellent, right?
Yep.
And that's where that shame comes in. That's where I so deeply relate to kind of that inner critic. It's like they are challenging you. It's like an Olympic coach almost, which, not to say Olympic coaches, I hope they're not all shaming. God, I hope not.
I doubt it, but who knows?
Right. But it's to like keep you on the wheel, to keep you in your cycle and to take a step back and to like observe the cycle versus participate in it. One feels so foreign and it feels so uncomfortable. And that's where shame and guilt come in even more because it's like, whoa, what are we doing? Like, we know the drill. You're wasting time now. You're losing time. And it's like, am I just pausing long enough to consider if I stay on this hamster wheel, is it aligned with what I ultimately want out of life? And this is a process I think you revisit a handful of times. There are definitely developmental periods where it's more prominent, like your mid-20s, what we call the quarter life crisis. Your around that 45 to 55 kind of midlife crisis. And there's scientific backing based on like stages of development, why this is. Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial stages of development is one of my favorite things I learned in grad school because you can go through and look at the life stages and what the biggest identity piece is like that you're seeking to achieve. Intimacy versus isolation being the one prominent in your 20s.
That's good.
So yeah, it's a really fascinating conceptualization, but also very humbling and being reminded that, okay, we're all going through this. We're all asking these bigger questions. You're not alone. And that's the basis of why we wanted to do this podcast is
exactly.
You will ask these questions amidst career successes, career failures, career questions, relational failures, relational wins, and that's part of being human.
Yes. And nobody makes it out unscathed. I think just by existing, we all, even what that guy said to you early on in your career, I had similar things. I think Belmont is almost a breeding ground. Going to a school that's so everybody sets out for such a specific thing, it can become competitive quickly. And I remember a girl, when I signed my publishing deal early on, said to me, I just can't understand why you have a publishing deal and I don't. And just the, I grieve with you about the people along the way who maybe it's their own hurt that turns into them attacking you or saying something that plants seeds of doubt in your own heart and mind. I just think what's so beautiful about this work is that we have an opportunity to become more attuned to how we are affected by things like this, and kind of do the work around it to help reframe it, and at the same time become more aware of how our words impact others. And that's something that I really, there's a book called The Four Agreements that I really love by Don Miguel Ruiz. And something that really matters is to be impeccable with your word. And that's one of the things that when I think about my values-based leadership or, relationships or however I want to be, I want to let my yes be a yes and my no be a no. And also use my words to speak life and encouragement into other people instead of taking away from somebody's successes or letting my own ego or comparison be threatened. I think it also comes down to like an abundance versus scarcity mindset. I think we've kind of been circling around that for a long time too, of we all operate either out of thinking that there's not enough room for us and that, or not enough song ideas, or not enough slots on the radio to get heard, or not enough jobs at the record label, so you have to posture and hustle your way into keeping your job. Or the abundance mindset of there's plenty of room, plenty of space, even just that inherent belief that we have worth, and letting that be what informs how we show up every day, not as a performance, but as a working earnestly towards that values-based performance that we want to have, doing things in alignment with who we are and what we value. And there are days that I excel at that, and there are days that I don't. And I think about my young 20s, and I think that's also something we mentioned at the beginning, is when you first show up on the scene, you want to be as cool and fit in as much as you can, and there's so much wonder of, wow, I'm here doing what I set out to do, and I got the job that I've dreamt of, for as long as I can remember. I was looking through album liner notes when I was 13, and now I'm writing with some of those songwriters that were in those liner notes. Or for you, working with artists that you were really passionate about and songwriters you were really passionate about. It's so cool, but at the same time, I think it's also a breeding ground for that veering into the hustle and into the not showing up in a values-based way when so much is asked of us. So I look back at my earlier 20s and I think, oh Lord, I wish I could do so much different about that time. But at the same time, if I hadn't been through what I went through in that time, I don't think I would have arrived at the work that I've done now. And I hope you can relate to that of, I think it took doing it the wrong way to get, and I don't even want to put this shame language around right or wrong, but doing it in a way that didn't align with my values versus showing up now today and doing it in a way that feels more in line with who I want to be.
Yeah. Like when you veer off the path or you're walking in a way that feels misaligned, your body knows. And whether that is a physical response, whether that's like an internal dissonance, I think we have cues that do, if we notice them and are willing to say, okay, what's happening here? Like our bodies are really compassionate in being able to raise the flag before we cognitively can realize what's going on. Yeah. That certainly was my case. Something you said, Emily, that really resonated was a topic I enjoy talking with, specifically those on the industry side, right? Because this has come up in some of the wellness, like intensive workshops I've done with some companies here. And I find that because of that little girl who would look at the liner notes and then all of a sudden is in the room with that songwriter or that artist, and you're like now part of the liner notes, you're like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. Again, the parts, right? Like it's like the part of you that's like geeking out, that's like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And then the part of you that's like, but are you fulfilled? Like, like, is this what you thought it would be? And that part terrifies us. We're like, shh, no, we made it, do not rock the boat. But also there's that inner nagging of like, okay, but is this it? And then maybe there's a fear part that comes in and is like, yeah, see, like, if you keep on with this, like, are you going to be happy? Yeah. And then what is happiness? And yeah, I definitely can relate, especially in my early 20s when I was working with songwriters. I didn't have as much the experience of like being the 13-year-old girl who was going through liner notes. The liner notes that I was looking at was simply for the lyrics, right? I just wanted to sing along to Taylor Swift songs. But I wasn't paying attention to the songwriters. Yeah. But when I ended up moving into, or what I would say stumbling into music publishing as a publisher, it was so fun in my early 20s to connect these dots and to see, oh my gosh, that's that person that wrote that song that meant so much to me when I was 15 years old. Or because we talked about this in one of our episodes with our guests about the nostalgia, there being a real like science-based backing on the music we loved in high school or during our adolescent years is still the music we cherish the most. For better or for worse.
Yeah.
It evokes something in us, right?
Yeah.
So I have had that experience multiple times and I was like, whoa, this is so cool. And yet there was also a part of me that felt kind of this like gentle hum underneath of, okay, but this feels a bit empty and I don't know what that is. And that scared me in terms of like, I didn't want to get trapped in just cherishing or associating with that. Like, oh my gosh, look how cool the things are that I'm doing in life right now. Like finding my worth in the fact that I was working with these people. And because then it becomes this external validation. And I think it can get kind of annoying to people. I hate to say it like that, but
it's true.
There are safe people. Don't get me wrong, right? Like there are people who you can be your uninhibited self with and be like, oh yeah, I worked on that song. That was really cool, right? Like, or I booked that co-write, and them not be like, you sound so egotistical in saying that.
They're not drinking their own Kool-Aid. Yeah.
Right. Like you're not seeking for them to be like, oh my God, you are so cool, but they deeply celebrate with you in that. So I don't know. I saw you were about to say something.
I felt that even in writing rooms, there's a difference. My policy, which some people would criticize me for and say that I'm a fangirl or whatever, and I don't always think that's seen as cool. But if somebody's work has meant something to me, and I have the fortune of being in a write with them, I tell them. I'm like, I write a lot with Gordy Sampson, who's one of my dear friends now, and he wrote Jesus Take the Wheel. And every time I play around with him and he plays it, I just kind of get a little teary because I think about like 10-year-old me listening to Some Hearts album on my boombox and how much I felt seen by those songs. And something we've wanted to cover that I've always wanted to talk about here is that relationship between ego and vulnerability. And I think that to act like you're better than everybody and not tell somebody what something means to you, I think that's a point of like, I do understand it from a certain perspective of you want to feel like an equal to that person. And so you armor up and you don't, tell them because you are like, okay, I'm just going to play it cool and do whatever. And I get that perspective. I think a lot of people in our industry show up very ego of like, I've done all this work and blah, blah, blah. My path, which feels like it can be an outspoken path at times, has been to show up how I'm actually feeling and knowing that I don't have it all figured out, and honoring people for what they've done instead of thinking, I'm too good to say out loud what I'm feeling inside, or I'm going to emit this image that I have it all figured out. That's something that I wish we could undo a little bit, because I think that showing up like you have it all figured out is a recipe for unraveling, in my opinion, because none of us really do. I think operating under the suspicion or under the idea that we have it all figured out, I think is just a recipe for somebody throwing a rock at our glass house and it all falling apart. And I just would rather say, here's how I really feel. Here's what I've accomplished, and that's cool. But at the same time, I don't want to ever emit the vibe that I'm cooler than anybody, or that I am God's gift to music, or whatever. I think it is a both and of, there needs to be a healthy dose of confidence to walk in and show up as your best self in an industry context. And people respond better to somebody who acts like they belong there versus somebody who shows up insecure. I definitely veer into showing up insecure too often, but I think I'm just very off-put by when that ego shows up in such a large way. It can be distracting to me, and kind of like I see through it. I don't know if that is the right way to say it, but anyway.
Well, and you feel, whether you're naming it as such or not, that you are not talking to the heart and core of this person. You're talking with a part of them.
Yes,
and
that's good.
That elicits, I think, our protector parts as well, because we kind of puff up, or we puff up or we shrink. We either match them in intensity, and we also start name dropping at the networking event. Yeah. And then you kind of feel like, it's just like gross after. Yeah. Or maybe you shrink into like, well, I'm just not going to say anything. And then maybe there's an inner self-righteousness in feeling like you're being humble, but also it's almost like it's a spectrum, For sure. And I've noticed that when someone is showing up in such a way, there is a challenge of like, am I going to match them because really it is an insecure part. I think so too. Right. Like the boldness or the clout, heavy focus is really protecting the part of you that is like, am I worthy without these things? Am I worthy in spite of these accomplishments? And what happens when we just meet them with the same energy? Well, what is that with the goal of? Is it just making them feel small and inferior? Like, does that get us anywhere? I don't think so. I've never found it to. But I don't know. I think kind of staying steadfast and just trying to notice when someone shows up that way. For me, it happened a lot at networking events, or even during coffee meetings, when you're maybe meeting someone for the first time and they feel this pressure to kind of list their resume. That's one posture. And then I've also noticed a posture in this business where people, they crave the vulnerability at those intimate coffee meetings where it's like, oh, we didn't even talk about music. We talked about mental health. We talked about family. We talked about what they're going through. And it's like the fact that has been a common thread I've heard and experienced myself too, tells me that we're also hungry for that in this industry. Real human connection. So yeah, that's really my whole thought on posturing is like, it elicits a similar posture in the other person, unless that someone is willing to break the cycle and be like, do I want to engage in that?
For sure.
I don't know.
I think the best art is born out of a place of connecting on a human level first. If somebody's able to share their real human experience, I think that's the art that touches us the most. you know, from, I think Taylor Swift talking about how intensely she felt about her breakups felt so true to her. That's why it resonated so deeply with middle school girls everywhere, myself included. It's like, I think that authenticity, I think sometimes artists get lost in, sometimes they're trying to posture their way into working at radio or doing what their record label asked them to do. Or, you know, I feel that. And I think the greater consumer can sniff out that, like, when we're not showing up as our authentic self. And I think the same thing for us as we're in our day-to-day interactions is, how can I get to the heart of what I'm feeling, and my goal is always to get to the heart of what the other person has experienced and what's their story and why they are the way that they are. And I think that's a more sustainable way than, I was in a session yesterday where somebody turned to me and said, so what have you been working on lately? And who have you been working with lately? And it's always like, I kind of clam up, because even if I've worked with the coolest people ever, I just am like, why can't we just talk about, like, what's going on? You know, it's just very like, and I had a therapist, this was in the context of my dating life, but probably 5 years ago, I think I was showing up on dates and being like, well, I have this and this and this and this and this going on, and I'm doing this. And she said to me, Emily, don't lead with your resume when you're trying to get somebody to love you. Like, people aren't going to love you for your accomplishments. And I think I keep saying I'm an Enneagram 3, but it's true. I show up, and like, those achievements and those accolades are what it's like a driver for me. And so separating from, I won't be loved for what my resume looks like, which in the down moments, it's like, thank God, because, you know, I think if we let our worth be attached to that external validation, it can be such a slippery slope. But yeah, I think our industry does tend to lead with resumes and what viral artist are you representing, or what songwriter with hits are you working with? And that's the first thing that pops into your head of like, I'm legitimate because I'm associated with X, Y, and Z. But I'd rather just see the value of somebody's heart. And maybe that's not the currency that we operate under, but I think that the humanity piece matters so much. So yeah, anywho.
Well, that speaks to, again, what you value, right? And not everyone is going to value the same things in this business. That's true of any industry, and that is okay. It's finding your tribe, finding your community that shares your values. And if the value of, you know, staying and sustaining in this industry is in your top 5 or top 3, then how do you do that in, again, keyword, a sustainable way? How do you find people that help root you and hold you accountable? Not if, but when the cycle of success hits. I just think, I'm thinking of recently at Porter's Call's Evening of Stories, Natalie Hemby, one of her last stories, well, she came on and sang Rainbow, that Casey Musgraves had cut. And her story behind that was so beautiful. But she was like, you know, I was denied by so many labels as an artist, and I felt like poo. And then, you know, I was this coveted songwriter, and I thought my you know what didn't stink. And just her naming so openly what I think, regardless of where you stand in this industry, whether it's as an artist, a songwriter, a producer, an executive, assistants even, like, you are not, you can't avoid this cycle of success kind of catching up to you at some point. Because if everyone is like, again, like, oh my gosh, that's so cool, that's so amazing that you're working on that, like, it does something to us, right? And it's one thing to be affirmed and loved and adored for who we are at our core. it does something else to us, I think, when we receive adoration and attention for those things we're doing, because then we run that risk of over-identifying with the doing instead of being. And so that would be my greatest kind of like challenge, I think, to this industry is the doing is not bad. Like, it's action oriented. It has a really beautiful product at the end that can move and impact many people in their own stories. And in the process, are you still being? Because it's in the being that actually is going to help root you, ground you, and help inform what type of creative executive you show up as on a daily basis, and what types of business partners you will or will not attract.
Yeah, I think that there can be a trap of when you identify with what you're doing, even if you've done it to the best of your ability, you have a number one song, or you write something that resonates with millions of people on the internet or whatever, there's always that silent pressure. I've watched some of my friends who are having hits go through it of, well, now I have to do it again. And then the cycle starts all over again of, okay, now I have to do a whole nother version of what I just did and had to climb a mountain once, and now I have to do it again. Or, if you're not doing enough, that pressure of, I need to get to wherever the other people are getting to. Whereas when we're living in alignment with who we are and what we value, I think the waves and the craziness that swirl around us are a lot easier to navigate if we feel rooted where we are. The storm can come, but if we keep returning to what we value, there's a lot of peace in that. And so, that's the journey we're on. And I hope that somebody resonates with this. And I'm just really grateful for you and your time, sister, and getting to soak up your wisdom is really invaluable. So I'm grateful for this conversation and for who you are and all that you're doing for our industry and our world, because it has generational impact. It's really cool to watch.
Oh, thanks, Sam. Right back at you. It's fun to have these conversations, and I think so important that we're bringing them to light, because we, as well as many of the people we've sat with over the years, have had very similar conversations. And how do we publicize? How do we normalize that these are questions, areas of consideration that we really want to contemplate? Like, how do we contemplate well, and how do we do it together to just keep the dialogue going? So thank you for your time as well.
Well, I hope it's a wonderful day.
Yeah, you too. Thanks for listening in to our friends, family. I'm sure you're in there too, and colleagues. Hope this conversation has resonated and blessed you in some way.